fine. Okay, so today we're going to go back to the discussion which our Mishnah had about these special four-cornered places. You have these wells, right? These wells that people need to drink water from, and Chazal, although normally have fences around things, over here, when it came to these wells, Chazal, sages came along and they instituted a lot of these leniencies, a certain specific leniency, which were these four posts, right? These four L-shaped posts at the corners, and they treat that as if it is a wall, as if it's closed off, even though it's not closed off, and in order to allow people to drink from those wells. So today we're going to discuss A, how much space can be between those posts, and B, a couple of questions about what makes a valid post. Nothing crazy. So let's jump in. So the Gemara says, 19a3, all the way in the bottom of 19a3, Uveinehem kimlo shtei. Okay, so we quote the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, between the double posts, there's an open space as wide as two teams of oxen, right? In other words, remember we said there's the idea of two teams, right? One team going this way, one team going that way. And so the Gemara is going to discuss this a little bit more. The Gemara says, when the Gemara described the teams, it said they're tied together and they're not loose. Now, if you're tied together, by definition, you're not loose. That's what tied together means. The Gemara asks about this redundancy. Pshita, kevan detani le dikshuras havu. Since the Mishnah said that these oxen have to be tied together, ananya dina and lo havu mutaros. We know that they are not tied together. We know that they're not loose. What's the deal with the repetition? So madatim, I would have thought kishuros ke'ein kishuros. I would have thought tied just means that they're close together. It doesn't mean literally that they're tied together, which would be a little bit more space, right? When something is tied together, it's really tight. When it's not tied together, it's next to each other, right? So maybe it's like kishuros means they're next to each other. Aval mamishlo, maybe it doesn't have to actually be the measurement of tied together. Kamash mlan v'lo mutaros, not loose, meaning that they're mamish tied together. They really are tied together. Okay, we'll see exactly what those measurements are in just a moment. But the Gemara is trying to give the parameter. The Mishnah over here is giving us the parameters of the dimensions, and you want to measure how much space could be between these posts. So Gemara is saying it's these teams of oxen which are really tied together, meaning it's a smaller amount. Don't think it's a little bit larger, which would have been if they're just next to each other. No, they really are tied together. Okay, so now the Gemara says a little further. The Mishnah said, "Achas nechneses v'achas yotze," one going in and one going out. Now, when it says one going in, one going out, keep in mind we're talking about there. If you recall, there's two opinions. One opinion says two teams of 3 oxen. Other person said two teams of 4 oxen, and it says one going in, one going out. Now, when you're both going in the same direction, you need less space. When you're going in two directions, you need a little bit more space. Now, going in and going out, it could be referring to each one of the animals, all 6, let's say, one in, one out, one in, one out, one in, one out, which would be a little bit more. Or it means one team going in and one team going out, which would be a little bit less space because it's just less movement, right? In other words, if you have 6 people, one going this way, and then, back and forth, one going this way, one going that way, so it's going to be a little bit larger. If you have 3 going this way and 3 going that way, it's going to be a little bit tighter. So the Gemara clarifies and says, Tana was taught in the Brisa, Rivka Nechneses, Rivka Yotzes, a team of oxen going in, a team of oxen going out. So in other words, don't think it means one, okay, which would be a little bit larger, rather means one team going this way, one team going that way, and that's the space. Okay, so far it's been a lot of now we're about to get into what the actual measurements are. Okay, so Tana Rabbanan, we quote a Brisa which elaborates a little bit more on our Mishnah by giving it numbers, because again, our Mishnah says, okay, a team of oxen of 3, a team of oxen of 4, tied together, not tied together, right? So this is all like to you and me, like this is all, we have no idea how big is an ox, how big is a cow, like how big are these measurements? The Gemara is going to talk about that. So it says the Gemara says a Brisa, Kama Rosh of Aruba Shal Par. Remember we said that the amount of space that you need, you can't have these posts immediately next to the well. You can't have a well and a post right next to it. You have to have enough space that a cow's able to put most of its body in. Because why? There's a concern. I'm going to pull water out and then bring it to the cow. I'm going to go outside of the posts, and therefore there has to be enough space for the cow to put most of its body in. Okay, so how much space is that? How much the head and most of the body? Shtei amos, 2 amos. The kama ovia shel para. How thick is a cow? Width. Okay, ama ushnei shlishay ama. An ama and 2/3 of an ama is the width of a cow. Okay, shein ke'eser, which in total, when you start putting, so which means if you do the math, according to a mayor who allows the gap wide enough for 6 oxen, the Gemara is assuming that cow and ox are one and the same, and the Gemara is saying that if you do the math over here, that the width of a cow / ox is an amma and 2/3 of an amma, and you multiply that by 6, okay, 2 teams of 3, that comes out to eser, shein ke'eser, that's 10 amos. Yeah, you with me? In other words, right, we're saying each cow ox is 1 and 2, what do we say? 1 and 2/3, right? 1 and 2/3 wide. And he says there's 2 teams of 3, right? So, 10. Fantastic. Thank you for doing the math. Okay, that's Rameir. So Rameir says there is a width of 10 amos between these 2 posts. Yeah, so far so good. Rabbi Yehuda says it was for 8 oxen. Okay, so 8 times 1 2/3 is, he says, Kishlosh esrei amma, ucha arba esrei amma. He says approximately 13 amos, approximately 14 amos. Now that's a funny term. What does that mean? Approximately 13, approximately 14. So Gemara is going to elaborate and explain what he means. So he says, first of all, the Gemara goes back to, that's the end of the brisa. Okay, so again, we're now talking about what is the measurement between these 2 posts, right? You have post over here, post over here. One opinion said it was 6 animals. So 6 animals equals 10 amos. That's the opinion of our mayor, right? And then you had Rabbi Yehuda saying it's 8 animals. So 8 animals, again, it's 1 2/3. So 1 2/3 times 10 is 6. 1 2/3 times 6 is 10. And 1 2/3 times 8 is, we're about to see what it is. But the Gemara says, the way the Gemara frames is, it's like 13, like 14. Now, the Gemara is not a 14-year-old teenager, so when it says like, it's a funny term. So that's what the Gemara is about to ask. Why do you say like? Okay, so the Gemara says, Esther Havyan. When it comes to a mayor, the first opinion, 6 times 1 2/3 is actually exactly 10. So the Gemara says you're right. It doesn't mean by saying approximately like it's not approximate. It's exactly 10. But the reason it says like is mishum debayla misni seifa kishlosh esrei. The reason it does that because for Rabbi Yehuda it wants to say like 13 because there it's not exact. Ask the Gemara kishlosh esrei tzvei havyan. Why does it say approximately 13? It's more than 13. The Gemara says mishum debayla misni ke'arba esrei because the Brisa also wants to say it's like 14. Which is, okay, meaning it's like a little bit less than 14. So Gemara says, but it's not like 14, it's significantly less than 14. So Gemara says, Amar Papa, Yeseros al shlosh esrei, ve'ena magios le'arba esrei. When the Brisa said, like 13, like 14, it was a way of saying it's between 13 and 14. That's the way, again, why it chooses to speak that way, I'm not exactly sure, but it could have said, 13 and, X amount, whatever the fraction would be. What would the fraction be? Okay, it's all good. Don't worry. I have no idea. I don't even begin to guess. Okay. Oh, wait another. 13 and a third. Thank you. So you're slacking off. Thank you, Murray. Okay. Well, no one's fact checking you. Okay. So it's okay. So fine. Bottom line is it's like a little bit more than 13, but it's not yet 14. Bottom line is that's what it meant. Yehuda said Kishlosh esrei amma arba esrei amma. He said like 13, like 14 to say it's somewhere in between. When Rameir said like 10. He didn't mean like 10. It just, sometimes you do that. Again, keep in mind, the Bryces, Mishnayos, they're all being memorized. So sometimes you'll say, the reason I'm going to use a similar type of language up on the beginning is because the second part's going to use that type of language, so I'm going to be consistent, so I memorize it. Rameir, it's exactly 10. But he says like 10 because Rabbi Yehuda is going to say like. So he's also saying like, so that helps you memorize. It helps you like have a consistency, helps you have a flow. And then we get to Rabbi Yehuda, it's like 13, like 14, meaning it's somewhere in between. Okay, now we have measurements about how much space could go between 2 poles. And again, I don't mean 2 poles alone. It's going in all directions. What's the measurement between them? According to Rabbi 10, according to Rabbi Yehuda, 13, whatever, and a third or whatever it is, somewhere between 13 and 14. That's the amount of space based on their, based on whether it's 3 animals or 4 animals in each team Okay, so let's go a little further. Now the Gemara says, explains this machlokas a little bit more. Amara Papa, it explains the following. In our Brisa, if you recall, in our Mishnah, we had a machlokas about whether you need these. Remember? We had opinions. We had Rameir saying you need these extra sticks in between, these extra boards in between, right? Everyone's talking about, first we start talking about these corners, and then Rameir said you put these extra boards in between to close it off a little bit more, right? But now the Gemara is going to elaborate and talk about what that machlokas is, and what's the basis for this machlokas, whether or not you need these boards in between. So Amra Papa, Bivor Shmona, if you have an 8 amma pit, okay, Dekuli amma lo pligi, de lo be'inam shutim. You have an 8 amma pit, everyone's going to agree that you do not need single posts. Okay, because the opening in such a case, if it has 8 amos of if you look at you see the math for those, right? Let's say you have a circle of, let's say you have 8 over here. Okay, that's terrible. Okay, let's say you have 8. Forget it. Let's go. Look at the picture on your page. You see, if you have a circle of 8, then you're going to have an extra. By definition, you're going to have like 2 amos on the side, and so it's not going to the gap between the bottom line is if you have an 8 amma pit of water, you're going to have. And then you have the space for the animal, right? So you're not going to have more than 10 amos between each post. It's going to be basically 8 amma pit, and then you have 2 amos, on the sides for the animal to get in, and between the posts you're going to have less than 10 amos, right? And if you recall, Rameir said, how much space are you allowed to have? 10 amos. right? So in a case where it's an 8 amma pit, everyone agrees you don't need extra posts because the gap between the corners is less than 10 amos. And Rameir said that as long as less than 10 amos, the two corners work, okay? Before Shtei Mesrei, if the pit is 12 amos wide, Dekuli amo lo pligi, Dibi'inam shutin. Okay, so if it's going to be 12 amos, then everyone's going to agree they are going to need posts, okay, because then the openings are going, because if it's going to be 12 amos, if the pit's going to be 12 amos, and you need extra space for the animal, now we're up to 12 plus 2 is 14, right? And remember, Rabbi Yehuda said, how much space can you have in between? Not 13 point something. So once it's a 14 space gap, then he's also going to agree it's too wide. And therefore, he's going to certainly agree you need to have something in between to kind of close the gap, right? In other words, we're saying like this. We're saying now, Rameir agrees that when it's less than 10 amos, I don't need those lines in between, those boards in between. When it's more than when it's 14, then even Rabbi Yehuda is going to agree the gap's too large. I need to put a stick in between. I need to put like a thing in between to close the gap because he said 14. And when it's already 12 amos wide, and therefore you have the 2 extra, and now you're at 14, that's too wide for Rabbi Yehuda. So you're certainly going to need something in between. Right? Ki pligi, when they argue, bishmona ad shnei mesrei, they're arguing about a case where it's between 8 and 12 amos. Lira Meir, according to Meir, who said again, you're only allowed to have a gap of 10, binam shutin. You need to have an extra single post in between to close the gap off, because he holds that it's not going to be permitted if it's more than 10 amos. Rabbi Yehuda, according to Rabbi Yehuda, who said that you're allowed to have it larger than 10, he holds it has to be less than 13 point whatever. There, lo binam shutin, you're not going to need to put a straight one in between because the gap is not too large. Right? So in other words, what's coming out over here is that when we read the Mishnah, if you remember, there seemed to be two machlokas. One was how wide. Rameir saying 3 animals, Rabbi Yehuda saying 4 animals, whatever, 2 teams of 4, 2 teams of 3. And then you had another machlokas about these sticks in between. It seemed like 2 separate things. Now the Gemara is coming along and saying, no, they're actually one and the same. What they're arguing about how much of a space do you have in between, right? And once you say that they're arguing about, so one says 10, Rameir says 10, Rabbi Yehuda says 13 point something, and now based on that, in a scenario where the gap is somewhere between 10 and 13, they're arguing, do I need to put a stick in between? Because one holds that gap is too large, and one holds, no, that gap is not too large. That's the point. It's really one same machlokas about how much space could be between those posts. Okay? Make sense? Okay, so Rav Papa Mike Mashlan, the Gemara says, what's Rav Papa teaching us? Tanina. We learned to the Mishnah that Rameir says it's no more than 10 amos. Yehuda says it's, basically based on our Mishnah, we learned 3 animals, 4 animals. So what's he come and teach us? Rav Papa Bryce L'Shmiele. Rav Papa does not hear the Bryce that we started off with, or that we just learned earlier, about the measurement of the oxen or the cows. In other words, this whole point is all predicated on the measurements that we just learned earlier today, which was that there's 2 amos. You need 2 amos for the head and for the Rosh of Aruba, for most of the animal, and that each animal is going to be 1 1/3 or 1 2/3 wide. That's all based on things we just learned from the Brisa. The Kamashlan Brisa, Rav Papa never learned this Brisa. Rav Papa never heard this Brisa with all these measurements, and therefore Rav Papa is coming to teach us what is basically based on the measurements that we just learned from the Brisa. He's coming to spell that all out because he never heard the Brisa, and that's why he is coming to add that point. Okay, fine. So now we understand the machlokas again between Rabbi Yehuda and Meir is primarily about whether or not you have how much space you're allowed to have between these 2 posts. Between the posts, is it 10 amos? Is it 13 point something amos? Okay, now the Gemara gives a little key words to help the memorization of the following questions that are going to be asked. We're going to see arich, it means extended, yoser means more, betel means a mound, chitzas means partition, chatzar means courtyard, shivsha, dried up, siman, and amanic, that's all in amanic. Okay, so there are people, by the way, who memorize entire amudim of Gemara, and they'll use these signs. These signs help them. There's like a whole movement right now of people learning new signs. I forget what it's called right now. That basically, and so just like memorize all of Gemaras. They have for each Gemara, they'll have 3 words, and those 3 words will help them remember the entire daf of Gemara. It's pretty amazing.
Jerry Lucas.
Okay.
Remember Jerry Lucas?
I do. Yeah. So
used to be memorize pages of phone books.
There you go. Okay, that's a different level, but yeah, but that's but this is still pretty impressive. Okay, so let's go further. So now we're going to have a bunch of questions, 6 questions. Abai is going to ask Rabba all about these corners. So Bai Mine, Abai Mi Rabba. Herich b'diyomdin kishir pshutin. Okay, let's say a person. Okay, so let's go back to our pictures. Okay, so let's say you have a case where you have your well. And there's too much space. Let's say there's too much space. Rameir holds again. How much space do you have between them?
10.
Thank you. Okay, 10 amos. Okay, so 10 amos. But let's say there's 11 amos over here. So according to Meir, what if I just go like this, right? And I just extend each wall a little bit, right? Would that be sufficient? Would that work? Right, now what's the question? Why would that not work? Of course, it's less than 10 amos. The problem is that since these are at the end of the day, people come along and they're like, oh, this is a 10 amma gap. And then these things are pretty small. They're pretty insignificant. And maybe a person won't realize that you've just extended this wall. They're very small, like lousy walls. Maybe a person won't realize you've extended this wall, and therefore they'll say, oh, when you have more than 10 amos, I'm allowed to use these four-cornered things, and it's fine. And they won't realize that this thing is not 1 amma, it's 2 amos, right? Because it's so insignificant, maybe Rameir would disqualify just extending the wall, and he would necessitate, don't extend the wall in this case, not allowed. You'd have to actually go ahead and put an extra wall, right? Because it's so insignificant, maybe, right, does he allow us to extend the wall or not? That's question number one. So Rameir Mao, Amr Lahu, Tanisu was taught in the Mishnah, Uvilvachi Yarbe Bepasin. The Mishnah said if there's more of a gap, then what do? You add to the board. My love, what does it mean? Marach bid Yomin. Adding to the board sounds like exactly this, adding a little bit to the corner, and that would be sufficient. So where it says no, lo, demapish v'avid pshutin, doesn't mean you add to the board, rather it means you add to the boards. In other words, it doesn't mean you extend one board, it means you add another board, and that's what it means. The Gemara says, if that's the case, the terminology says add to the boards. Adding to the board implies that you're extending the board. It should have said, provided that you add a board. So Tani Achiyar B'Pasin, the Gemara says, okay, switch the letter. It's just a letter base. It's not significant, therefore there's no raya, there's no proof that you're misreading the Mishnah, and therefore the Gemara says there's no proof. Okay, Ikidami, there's another version of this dialogue. Amrle, he answered him to Nisua. So again, the question was, am I allowed to extend a board, or do I need to add a new board? So the way he answered him, Rabbah said, Amr late, and Nisu was taught, Uvachi Yarbe Pasin. It says, provided you add to the board, my lav, Demapish V'Avib Pshutin. Implication is that he makes Demapish V'Avib Pshutin, that he adds, that he goes ahead and he adds another board. Okay, at this point, the Gemara is assuming the Mishnah means the exact opposite. The Gemara assumes that it means that you go ahead and add an extra board. Lo Demarch B'Yumin. Maybe though what it means is that you extend the board, Hachinam Mistabra, and which actually makes sense, Mitanu Uvachi Yarbe Pasin, because that's actually the terminology of the Mishnah, that you add to the boards. Shema Mina, and this version says the Mishnah, because the simple read of the Mishnah is saying that you are allowed to indeed go like this. Shiyar b'pas means adding to the board, and therefore the Gemara is saying, according to the second version, the Gemara resolves the question and says you are allowed to do this, and that's fine. Now, if you recall, in the Mishnah, Rameir was the only one who mentioned the adding of the boards. Okay? Why did that make sense? Because if you recall, just a quick review, Rameir says 10 amos. Rabbi Yehuda said 13 amos. We just pointed out that their machlokas is only in the case when it's between 10 and 13. And so when the Gemara said there's a case that they argue, Rameir, according to Rameir, that it was larger than 10 amos. Rameir said, add a board. We never heard Rabbi Yehuda say anything about adding boards. And therefore the Gemara is now going to, because according to Rabbi Yehuda, we're talking about a case where it's smaller, the gap was smaller than 13 amos, right? So the Gemara now is going to question, what about in a case where it's 20 amos? Does Rabbi Yehuda also allow this, putting a board in the middle or not? That's something we just haven't clarified. So, okay, so according to Rabbi Yehuda, does he make single posts? Does he extend the double post? What does Rabbi Yehuda do in a case where you have these wells and it's a much wider area? Amrle, Rabbi answered, Tinisu was taught, okay, so now we had a brisa, which we quoted earlier. How close, right? One of the first questions we have to ask is, how close can these posts be around the well? Okay, so when I answer today, Rosh of Ruba Shal Para. Again, you need to have, if you have your well over here, there has to be enough space that the cow, I'm not even going to bother. Okay, but a cow, that's your cow. The cow can have the most of its head and most of its body, right? So this is most, this is majority. That's going to be okay, right? Because or else we're going to potentially take the water outside of this section. That's going to be a problem. Fine. And then we say, now that's how close they can be. But how far can they be? How much space? Let's say I don't want my sticks over here. Let's say I want to put a stick over here and a stick over here, right? And ignore these. Right? Is that going to be okay or not? Right? What do we do in that case? So how far can you go out? Right? How far can you put these posts around this well? So the Gemara says, afilu kar ve'afilu karaim, even a car, even two cars. Okay? Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. He says beis asayim mutter. He says two beisa, which is much smaller. Yoser beis asayim aser. If it's more than two beisa, according to Rabbi Yehuda, it's forbidden. Okay, now the Gemara, so again, we have machlokas. According to the Chachamim, you could go an exceptionally far away from the well, and according to Rabbi Meir, According to Rabbi Yehuda, it's limited to two beisa. Ask the Gemara, Rabbi Yehuda, all these other cases, a field, a coral, a backyard, courtyard, a field bas chameshes korin, a field bas sar korim. We have a brisa which teaches us that it could be huge. So why over here shemutter it's permitted? Why are you so stingy? Why are you over here? Are you saying it has to be so tight? So Amar Lehen, he says to them, no question. Zomechitza vilupasin. He says this is a wall. You're asking me from a chatzar. A chatzar is a courtyard, right? In other words, let's say you have a garden. It's a beautiful garden. People don't live there, and therefore, fine. So, are some limitations how far it could be? It could be huge, right? Over here, though, he's saying it's limited to base asayim. Okay, without getting to the numbers, it's much smaller. So Gemara is asking, what's the difference? A chatzar, which is also not really around a house, you could be tremendous. Over here, football fields. Over here, when it comes to the well, you're being so stingy. What's the difference? He says, big difference. There, it's surrounded by a wall. Right? A wall is obviously, granted, people don't live there. And therefore, it's a subpar type of space. It's not really a private domain because people don't live there. But at the end of the day, it's surrounded by walls. Over here, you have these dinky little L-shaped things in the corner. It's nothing, right? So we're so much more, right? And therefore, we're going to be more machmir we're going to be more stringent about how much space you have around the well. So the Gemara says, Vimisa. Now, so why are we quoting this? Because again, what was the question? The question was, according to Rabbi Yehuda, do you extend walls? Or do you put new pieces in between? So, Vimisa, if it's true that according to Rabbi Yehuda, the only way to correct the double posts would be to go ahead and add to them, right? We asked the question, according to Rabbi Yehuda, are you allowed to add to them, or do you need to put a new post? Now, if you're adding to them, all of a sudden you're going to have larger posts, which are going to be like substantial walls, because you extended them. Let's say you have a case where there's a huge gap of 30 amos in between. So what are you going to do? You're going to go ahead and add to this and make it a long wall. Right? Or alternatively, we asked, according to Rabbi Yehuda, do you just have to go ahead and add like separate boards and not have them all attached? So Misa, if it's true that Rabbi Yehuda would say that the only way to do it is extending the walls, then then in both cases, in the case of the well and in the case of the chatzar, which he was just contrasting from the courtyard, and in the case of the well, where it's going to be, where the only way to make a large space smaller is by making these long walls. In both cases, they have walls. Why are you distinguishing and saying one case there's boards and one case there's walls? If Rabbi Yehuda holds the only way to make a large space smaller is by extending the walls, extending the corners, then in both cases there's walls. Right? Again, the whole way, what Rabbi Yehuda is saying is, don't ask me a question from a chatzar because there you have walls. Here we only have small things. What do you mean? If we're talking about a base core or a base asayim, a large space, and you're telling me that Rabbi Yehuda, we're entertaining the possibility that according to Rabbi Yehuda, the only way to close the gap is by extending the walls, that means you're going to have, in both cases, you have walls. So Mara says, no. You're right, we both have walls, but there's a big difference. Zotar is mechitza lao pirtza saba eser. In the case of the courtyard, it's the reason that a partition works is because it's considered a wall. And therefore, the gap is only allowed to be up to 10 amos. Okay, the elu turas pasan alein for same amos shlish. Whereas over here, whether you have these extended walls or whether you just have corners, which are just, and then boards, the point is that it's a whole different concept. Conceptually, this is called pasan, this is called boards, and therefore, because it's boards, you're able to have much larger, because it falls under another category of why this is considered partition off, which is called pasan, which is called boards, and whether it's like this or whether it's like this, there's going to be a whole separate set of halachos that you have the 13 plus amos gap in between, and therefore, again, you can't compare the two. So in other words, the Gemara is saying, it's true. There is a possibility that Rabbi Yehuda would say you need to have like wall-like structures over here, but it's not being closed off because we treat it like a wall. It still is its own unique beast. It's called pasan, it's called boards, and therefore it has its own set of halachos, which is a limit of 13. You have this gaps of 13, which is allowed. More than that is not allowed, right? And therefore, don't compare it to a case of a chatzar where the whole idea is it's a wall, and therefore there's a gap of 10 amos and no more than 10 amos. Okay, let's go a tiny bit further. Let's say you have a mound. Okay, you have a mound of 4. Okay, right now we've been talking about boards, but in certain halachos you have places where you have a very steep mound, and that's considered a wall, right? If you remember from Masechah Shabbos, if you have, let's say, like an area space where you have a mound that's that's very narrow. It goes like with 10 tefachim high, and within 10 tefachim, within 4 amos, you hit the whole height of 10 amos, right? So you can see the picture over here to just show the measurements. That's considered a wall, even though it's on an angle. That's considered a wall. Okay. So the Gemara asks, "Tell mislaka to arba nida mishum diyomad or inu nida mishum diyomad." Let's say you have a well that's surrounded by these inclines. Is that going to be considered a partition or not? Okay, it's a long davening, so we're going to stop over here. Have a great day. We'll pick up tomorrow. Okay.